Welcome to Case by Case. This is a podcast brought to you by Luke Zadkovich and Calum Chain from FZ. We don't have Calum today, but we are delighted to have Rufus Constable on the pod with me. Hello, Rufus.
Hi, Luke. How are you doing?
Good, thank you. Good. How are you?
Yeah, very good, thank you. Looking forward to getting stuck into this.
Welcome to Case by Case, but also welcome to the firm. Rufus joined us a few weeks ago and we got to catch up recently in London. He's joined our London office. What areas of law are you interested in, Rufus?
I've had a fairly broad, basically all things maritime, all things trading. I've done a lot of casualty work. I've done a fair amount of contentious and non-contentious shipbuilding work. So a lot of wet shipping, a lot of dry shipping. Generally speaking, I like to have as many feathers to my cap as I can, but hoping to hone that interest and develop further with Floyd Zadkovich.
Oh, that's great. Yeah, no, we're really pleased to have you on board, and we've got a great case to talk about today, which is more on the I suppose it is a claim against a ship owner, so it's a shipping case, but we're really looking into the detail of how a commodity trader hedges their risk. And then how those losses that they may suffer when there are delays in shipping, how they can recover the hedging losses or not, or whether they need to take into account the hedging against their physical losses. So yeah, it's an interesting topic to be getting into.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think it does raise some interesting points as well for us private practice lawyers, as well as I suppose in-house legal teams, around exactly what you can get away with when you're trying to bring a case before the Court of Appeal, in terms of the way you need to construct and formulate your arguments to avoid getting should we say, telling off from the judge for trying to introduce new arguments and evidence on appeal.
Yeah, exactly. Like, much of this case is actually about the procedural rules around what you can appeal and can't appeal, and, you know, the prohibitions on introducing new arguments as you're going through the appellant system. It's a bit of a no-no. There are some grounds upon which you can do that, but as we're going to learn in this case, there's some real difficulties to doing so. It might be worth us getting into some of the facts and just talking through, you know, the world of commodity trading and hedging and what all that means, because we have a diverse base of listeners here on the podcast. We've got some out and out shipping law lovers, some on the operating side. We've got commodity traders who listen in, and we've also got plenty of listeners who are outside that world and are focused on other parts of the law. And on the pod, we cover lots of different areas of law. So I think this is one of those cases which is a little factually dense. There's a bit to get through, just to kind of lay the scene. In some ways, the legal parts of it are not that complex. They're kind of more straightforward, but just understanding what we're talking about, you know, internal hedging, external hedging, all this kind of stuff, is probably worth spending a bit of time on. What do you think, Rufus?
I completely agree. I think this is, like a lot of great cases, on the face of it, the facts seem to be fairly simple. The more you dig and the deeper you get into actually what's going on, and you peel back the, I suppose, the layers that the respondent in this appeal, the layers of what they do internally, it does become a bit more complicated. So I think, why don't I talk us through the basic facts, and then we can have a discussion about what Vitol was getting up to behind the scenes.
Let's do that. Before you do, I just want to give the case name, case citation, that kind of stuff for those who I don't know. I imagine some hypothetical listener out there who always writes down the case citation when I'm I'm reading this out. That probably doesn't happen, but nonetheless, we'll stick to form. So this is the case of Rhine Shipping DMCC and Vitol SA. As we mentioned, we're in the Court of Appeal. The judgment was handed down on the 23rd of May, 2024. So yeah, a few months ago now. And we've got case citation 2024 EWCA Civ 580. It's a decision of Lord Justice Underhill, Lady Justice Asplin, and Lord Justice Popplewell. And yeah, so it's in the Court of Appeal. So we've got a very kind of detailed summary of what happened in the Court of First Instance below. But before we get into that, I totally agree. Why don't we lay out some of the facts here, Rufus, and I'll hand over to you.
Sure. Well, fundamentally, this entire case revolves around the shipment of approximately 920,000 barrels of Brent crude from ports in West Africa to China. Now, Vitol, as I'm sure our listeners are aware, is a large commodities trading house, and they were the people who purchased this oil and had contracted with Rhine Shipping, the appellant, for the vessel MT DIJILAH to move cargo from point A to point B. Now, the cargo was being picked up in two ports in Africa. But at the first port, a third party actually arrested the vessel, and this was to do with an unrelated claim on the bunkers. So this obviously had a knock-on effect as to how quickly the vessel could move to the second port, Djeno, in the Congo, where it was picking up the remainder of the oil. Now, pursuant to the purchase contract, which was with a total subsidiary, which is rather amusingly called TOTSA in the judgment, but pursuant to that contract, the purchase price of the Brent crude was going to be determined by reference to basically Brent Dated price indexes published by Platts. And because the vessel was 6 days delayed and the market shifted in those 6 days, the price of the overall contract went up. Now, Vitol was unable to sort of, I suppose, recover some of that loss immediately from the party it was selling to, because its sale contract for that cargo was based on fixed on prices at fixed dates, which didn't revolve around the date of arrival at the port of discharge. So fundamentally, we have vessel is 6 days late, price increases in the meantime, and therefore Vitol are stuck holding this increased loss, which I believe was to the tune of about $3.7 million in increased price.
Exactly. Just pausing there. This decision doesn't go into, the underlying claim. Like it's essentially accepted that the cause of the delay was the owner's responsibility. I think it was an associated arrest of some kind. I think the arrest related to an associated party of the owners. And so that we don't really get into that in this decision. It's accepted that Vitol have a claim for their losses associated with the delay of those 6 days. And as you say, we're now looking at what are those losses, and we're focusing on their sale contract, and that because it had this fluctuating price, they ended up having to pay more for the buying of that cargo because of the delay.
Yeah, that's completely right. This is where I think the case where we start to move into considering how Vitol operate as an entity and the decisions they take really in day-to-day trading in order to manage their risk portfolio. So when they entered into the TOTSA contract, they entered into a separate contract with a related Vitol entity, I believe Vitol Asia, in order to cover their short position. In general, when Vitol enters into these contracts, it uses a system called Vista in order to basically map out its risk exposure across its entire trading platform. And this is where things started to get a bit, I suppose, interesting.
Vista is an internal software. It's a system that's developed by Vitol that runs across their whole global operation, albeit, as I understand it, each individual entity within the Vitol group runs its own subdivision of Vista, this software. How that works was covered a lot in first instance. There's quite a lot of evidence that was given on this Vista program and how it works by Vitol. And we have quite a chunky section in this Court of Appeal decision that quotes from the first instance decision on exactly describing how Vista works and how Vitol uses it and all the rest of it. It was almost like, we'll just pluck that from the first instance judgment and stick it in the Court of Appeal because there's a lot in it and it's well laid out, if I can say that.
Yeah, agreed. And so, well, given how detailed it is, I will try to give us a very succinct explanation of how Vista works, because I think it does underlie the later arguments that are set out by Rhine on appeal. But so yeah, fundamentally, it's called it's a group trade capture system. So when a physical sale or purchase is made by, in this instance, the Totsa oil being purchased in the Congo, it will automatically be matched to an opposite risk in Vista. Now, often this will be you'll probably match the purchase of one cargo to the sale of the same cargo, because obviously those are the same quantities from the same port of origin. They are the same cargo. But this doesn't necessarily have to be the same cargo. But generally, this will then be sort of referred to internally as the Vista hedge. Now, it is accepted at first instance that the term Vista hedge is not particularly helpful.
No, yeah, it's not actually a hedge at all.
They revised that term to the Vista match in expert evidence, which I think everyone agrees is a much more accurate way of portraying what's going on. Because it's not a hedge in the specialized sense of a transaction with a third party to be entered into to offset a particular risk in the original transaction. Ultimately, all it really is a way of grouping Vitol's transactions in such a way that the central risk management team can gain insight into Vitol's overall risk exposure across its entire trading business. This is really because once such a match has been made, it's then possible for Vitol to analyse the overall market or pricing risk inherent in any given Vista hedge. And Vitol's risk management procedures can then be applied to that specific hedge in order to either lock in profits or minimise the risk with subsequent market movements.
So can we just pause there, because we are throwing some jargon around which you and I know well, and have been in the depths of not just this case but many cases over the years dealing with this. But what is a hedge? Let's just start there. Can we just explain for a non-commodity trader what is a hedge in commodity trading?
Let's say you take on a contract that is that embodies a certain amount of risk. So I have a contract where, let's say for 100,000 barrels, and I know that the price may fluctuate between a certain amount over in the coming days. Now, I might then think, okay, I'm a bit concerned that if everything goes really badly wrong, I might make a fairly large loss on this trade. So I'm going to enter into another contract with different terms, possibly relating to a different commodity, which effectively means that you're using the potential outcomes in that second transaction in order to offset the losses that may possibly happen in the first transaction.
Yeah, it's almost like, and this is not a perfect analogy at all, but for anyone who likes a bet and going to the horse races, it's almost like when you bet on one horse to win and you put some money down and it's not a favorite, you've outlaid £10 on that horse, but you actually think, you know what, there's a very good chance that the favorite may come through. So you kind of put this side bet on to just cover some of your losses, your kind of downside. That's not a perfect analogy because you're actually taking an opposite position on the same transaction. And so the kind of two contracts we deal with here are physical contracts and paper contracts. I don't think we should get into the weeds on this because, there's a lot to talk about in that context, but the type of contract that Rufus is talking about in the first instance is the physical contract, where you're actually buying a physical commodity at some point in time in the future, and the price may fluctuate up and down on the market from which you've actually paid in the contract. So by the time you get that commodity in 2 weeks, 2 days, a month, the actual value of that physical commodity may have changed. So what you do is you then go into the paper market, into the futures, buy a swap, where you're actually taking the opposite position. So you're kind of, or if you like, locking in the delta that there would be between the price on the future market at the time when you will take possession of that cargo against the physical price at that date as well. So you're kind of locking in your margin as a trading company. Now, That can be good. It's a more conservative way to trade. And of course, trading companies of the size of Vitol, and indeed any trading company, will be constantly assessing its risk to the market. And if they don't hedge, it's what we what we refer to as speculative trading. So if they're not covered in the market with a hedge, it means they are at risk, as in the trader is at risk for the value that may change on that commodity from the time when they agree the price to when they actually get it. They're kind of exposed to whatever the market does. Now, if you read the market and say, okay, it's going to work for me, and I'm getting a good price on this purchase of commodities, and you take that speculative risk, then all well and good. It all goes well for you. However, if something happens to the market in the meantime, and it was unexpected and it really moves against you, you can be very, very heavily exposed to the market. And so what traders play with this, they play with that risk. They mitigate it when they want to. They may want to take a more conservative position when there's more volatility in the market, or where they think that it might move against them, or there's some headwinds coming up on a macroeconomic analysis. Or they may say, you know what, we think we're in pretty good times. We're going to run the market and not hedge off their position. So understanding hedging is kind of fundamental to how a commodity trader runs their business. And it's this concept, as Rufus says, of managing your risk exposure to the market.
But I think, and therein lies the rub of this entire case. Really, is what Vitol were doing actually physically managing their exposure, or were they simply taking an internal view on their overall exposure so that they then could decide what they were going to do facing the market? And I think, as we're going to see, Rhine had one opinion, and Vitol and the court had another. I think, as I sort of alluded to earlier, the ultimate, when this, it's dealt with in quite a lot of detail in the first instance judgment, which I don't think we need to get into. But what ultimately happened with the cargo concerned was that it was allocated its counter value, and then it was swapped and rolled around throughout the Vista system, ultimately to a point where, at least on Vista, it was moved around in such a way that it actually generated a gain in the Vista system for that identified Vista hedge. And that gain was somewhere in the region of $2.8 million. So Rhine, rubbing their hands together, I'm sure, said, well, by virtue of our breach, we have you have actually made a profit, or you've avoided a $2.8 million loss that you wouldn't have avoided, that you would have had this whole thing not happened. Therefore, any losses that you're claiming from us facing TOTSA should take account for this $2.8 million alleged windfall that by virtue of this unhappy accident you have actually come into. Now, I'm not necessarily sure I'm persuaded by those arguments, as neither was the first instance judge. But then again, that is the position that Rhine put forward originally.
Yeah, exactly. And what it highlights is, going back to the Vista system, Vitol's internal program, where they allocate all their trades and kind of match them up to assess their risk profile, is that there was some correlation or some allocation with the physical trade in question and some other internal swaps in the system. Now, as I understand it, what had happened was on those swaps, so the future contracts, they weren't direct hedges, but they were contracts that went the other way, if you like. When the delays occurred, there was some nominal rolling over of the dates under those other future contracts, which meant that while the price on the physical contract went up, on these other allocated contracts, it went down. And so this is the kind of windfall as you describe it. So it would have resulted, there's kind of a net loss of about 800,000 between the loss on the physical contract that's in question here and these other swaps, internal swaps that went the other way. Now, it's important to emphasize this concept of internal swaps or hedges and external swaps, external hedges. And it's also important to understand that hedging doesn't necessarily work only on a transaction by transaction basis, but it can also work across a portfolio, right? So this Vista system is very good, and other traders will have their own systems where it can identify across a whole portfolio how exposed Vitol is to certain movements in certain directions. And they can then go and buy other similar contracts. And they might not be a direct hedge on one particular transaction, but they can go into the market and take other futures that kind of would move in the opposite direction to the exposure that they have. And they can kind of buy those contracts and bring down the delta, bring down the risk exposure. And that's how this Vista system is really useful. Now, from a legal perspective, what we're interested in is the actual loss that's suffered by a party as a result of something happening. Here you've got the breach of a delay, the breach of a shipping contract, the breach was the delay caused by owners or related parties to owners. So you have a breach. It causes a delay. The losses associated with that breach were the increased prices on the physical contract. Then, and I'm keeping this, at a kind of high level, but a party who's seeking to kind of claim their losses, they need to bring to bear any savings they made in that transaction, right? And so what's being dealt with here on quite a granular level is, should the hedging, the kind of offsetting and risk management that the trading company has in place, should some of that be accounted for in offsetting the losses that here Vitol suffered as a result of this breach? And so what the law distinguishes between external hedging and internal hedging. And so would you like to just talk a little bit about internal, external hedging? What are we talking about that on a transaction basis?
Yeah, so I think, and this is the building bit of what you just discussed, I think it's almost unhelpful to view internal hedging as, as the judge sort of pointed out, the use of the word hedging is not particularly helpful, because what it's really doing, when you get down to the bare bones of it, is providing, I suppose, information that can be fed into the company's wider risk management position. And at which point Vitol might then decide to go and take out various contracts. But the actual action of automatically internally assigning contracts to matching opposites is not in itself a hedge. And quite frankly, as quite a lot is made of it in the first instance judgment, these allocations are often done automatically. There's no internal negotiation of contracts. There aren't any of the characteristics that you would expect from when looking at a traditional external hedge.
And indeed, you can, if you just think about it on a basic level, and I know it's quoted here in the judgment, you can't contract with yourself. At a fundamental level, you can't enter into a contract with yourself, which is what a hedge is. It's an external contract typically. So I totally agree with you. I think that's right.
And this is something that is discussed in the appeal judgment, which I think another element which makes Rhine's position even harder here is that because you cannot contract with yourself, and because these are not negotiated contracts between disinterested third parties, you cannot use the hedge positions created by, also the internal hedge positions created by Vista as indicative of the kinds of terms that might have been achieved externally hedging on the open market. Therefore, you cannot say, well, you've executed all of these internal hedges, though you would have been able to execute the external hedges on the same terms. Therefore, the notional gain which has shown up in your system is the amount that you would have sort of managed to claw back through external hedging. So there is just this remoteness issue as well that does come into it.
Yeah, you're right. I tend to think of this, the use of the Vista system in this case and the internal quote unquote hedging as more akin to a sophisticated management software. It's more a tool for someone sitting at the top of the company, right, or the top of a portfolio of trading and saying, what's our risk exposure at any one time? And what are they asking? They're thinking, well, what if the market moves in this direction? What if, the price of Brent Crude goes through the floor? What if it goes up? What does that do to our portfolio across the whole Vitol network? And indeed, they use it, as I said before, on an entity by entity basis. But even just looking at Vitol SA, the entity involved here, it allows management to have that bird's eye view of all the trades on the physical side, on the paper side, and see what's our exposure at any one time. And that they do that through this process of allocation.
I think the best way to think of it succinctly is, at its core, Vista is a netting off system. It is a way of cutting through the noise by almost cancelling out a number of transactions that are equal but opposite, so that you can get down to brass tacks and look at, okay, where is our exposure here? It's a way of cutting through in order to get, I think, as you say, as a risk management tool, to focus those who wield the reins of power, to focus their minds on the positions that need to be addressed.
Agreed. Now, let's just compare that for a moment with external hedging. What is external hedging on a transaction basis? If on a particular transaction, so what we've been talking about is looking at the Vista system, which gives this kind of ability to look at the exposure on a particular transaction, but it also gives this ability to look over the whole portfolio and to see where Vitol is exposed at any given time. But if they said, okay, there's not enough cover, if you like, for this particular physical trade that they've entered into Africa to China, external hedging is on a transaction basis. And I think it's helpful to compare that with the notion of internal hedging, and think through and understand what is external hedging. If we just focus on external hedging for a particular transaction, so the physical trade that Vitol entered into here for this commodity going from Africa to China, if they had plugged it into the Vista system and that system had identified there wasn't enough coverage for that particular trade, or indeed, they could look at it on a portfolio basis, but let's just focus on the one transaction. If they had identified that there are not similar paper futures that they'd entered into in their system so as to hedge that risk of the market movement on price, Vitol could have gone into the external market and papered and entered into a paper trade that would hedge the physical trade risk on this matter. That would be going and entering into a third-party contract. So nothing to do with internal hedging, not worried about whether they have another contract that sits against this one in their system. It's more going externally onto an exchange and saying, okay, we're going to take out a future here and hedge off externally that risk. And it's really important to identify what that is, because the law says that type of external hedging on a transaction basis like that does have to be brought into the reconciliation on what the trader's losses are here. So had Vitol had an external hedge that sat against this physical loss, so, we talked about the $2.8 million internal swap that nominally kind of sat against this trade. If that 2.8 had instead been an external hedge, the law, and this is good law, being affirmed a couple of times, is that the external hedge would have to be brought into the reckoning of that loss and offset the primary loss under the physical contract. And that's why it's so important to understand this difference between internal and external hedging. Do you have any comments on that element?
Not really, save as to say that I think that Rhine had a similar brainwave to you on appeal, because that is fairly similar to the new arguments that they tried to introduce on appeal, which I'm sure we'll get to in a minute.
Yeah, exactly. So that kind of argument was dealt with at first instance, okay? And they looked at this in some detail, and at first instance, which was not the subject of the appeal, it was accepted that if there was an external hedge, that would have had to be taken into account. But this internal type of hedge, as you've described for a number of the reasons you've mentioned, Rufus, that it is more of a internal kind of analysis tool that allows Vitol to see where its risk exposure is, that type of offsetting is not part of the quantification when it comes to looking at what Vitol's loss was under this shipping contract. And Vitol then appealed, and in the appeal, and there was a change of counsel as well in that, there was kind of a morphing, if you like, of the argument upon which permission to appeal was granted to what ended up being the new argument in the Court of Appeal. And so the Court of Appeal was then faced with a scenario where an appeal was made that was based on some of the issues that was dealt with at first instance. But then by the time it got to, the skeleton argument that was being put before the Court of Appeal, that argument had changed. And the appellant tried to argue, Ryan tried to argue, well, look, this is not a new argument. It touches on a lot of what was already dealt with at first instance. But actually, the court didn't like that very much. And as you said at the outset, there's a practitioner's tip here in that courts do not appreciate lawyers trying to advance new arguments at an appellant stage that have not been dealt with at first instance. That's not to say you can't come up with some new arguments in and around what you're actually dealing with. Of course you can. But you can't come up with something that's completely new that should have been dealt with by way of evidence, should have been dealt with by way of submission at first instance, and wasn't at all. And it's this kind of new argument now that the court in the Court of Appeal looks at.
I think it may be worth just having a quick look through exactly what Ryan's position changed to. So after some, should we say, legal musical chairs, we get to the position where Ryan make the following, I believe it was called pleasantly succinct argument by the judge, which, taking that what you will, but they basically argued that the pricing risk to which Ryan's breach exposed Vitol as a result of the delay was a directional price risk in the market on that cargo, resulting in the increase of the price to Vitol. The argument which Ryan ultimately ended up advancing was that the pricing risk for which Ryan's breach exposed Vitol could be understood as a directional price risk on that underlying cargo, and to the extent that the extent of the risk was defined by the rise reflected in the Brent Crude index over the 6-day period of delay. This pricing risk was added to Vitol's overall net position on its wider trades, and as a result, this only happened as a result of the breach. And this shift in Vitol's overall net position could not have happened, or would not have happened, without the breach. Now, this shift in the position was, as we've discussed at length already, matched somewhere in the Vista system by an oppositional risk of a directional fall in the market price for this Brent crude, and it was measured, by reference to the same place of origin, the same quantity, and it ultimately ends up being, Ryan's argument that in the absence of that breach, the oppositional risk of a fall in the market would have existed in Vitol's books anyway, because it already had this transaction that it matched the Totsa cargo too. So it's managed to pair off these two different cargoes. And without Ryan's breach, there would have been this outstanding risk in Vitol's books. They then go on to say that it's Vitol's avowed market practice to always try and hedge off risks where they can. So they kind of construct this slightly artificial argument to say, well, if we hadn't breached the contract and everything had gone to plan, you would have had this risk outstanding on your books, and you would have gone to market in order to go and hedge that risk. So they're sort of almost implying the existence of a hypothetical external hedge that would have taken place had this breach not happened. And therefore, whilst they do admit it's impossible to know what the terms of this hypothetical external hedge would have been, it is instructive to look at the way that the Vista system allocated the transactions as an indicative, sort of an indication of the likely saving that this hypothetical external hedge may have made Vitol. So this is all rolled into one to basically say you should still give us the benefits of this internal hedge as if it were an external hedge, because you would have moved externally had this not happened.
So yeah, just to kind of unpack that a little bit. So it's almost looking at the other end of it in a way, isn't it? It's a creative argument, I'll say that. And I think in many ways the law was against Rhine on the key way they put their claim initially. And, there's some creative lawyering going on here at appellant level to see how can we look at it in a different way. But it's the way that the argument kind of sat was that you're looking at the so-called internal hedge or the swap contract and saying, well, if the breach hadn't happened, there would have then been a loss, which Vitol would have had to go, well, not had to, but would have as a matter of course to cover. And that would have had a loss associated with it. And it's that cost, that loss that they have avoided, if you like, by this playing out in the way that it has, that we're trying to claim. So it's almost going like two steps away from where we are on the physical trade, and looking at what would have happened in that scenario, in a counterfactual no breach scenario. The problem, however, is that even just the way that we've described it, you can see, to make out that argument, you have to be able to say, what would Vitol have done? That kind of key word would in there, because that is something that requires evidence. That is a matter that Vitol may come along and say, as a matter of fact, well, our system does this. We usually do this. In that scenario, we would have gone and covered the position, or we would not have. Sometimes we write it. That is a matter that there needed to be some evidence on. And then Rhine would have had the opportunity to cross-examine on that and, chip away at whatever the Vitol witnesses were saying. The two experts would then overlay that and say, does this make sense? Is this the way that traders typically work? How believable is it that Vitol would not have moved for an external hedge of that oppositional risk? And you may have different views on the expert side of this. All of that to say that once that becomes in part a factual question, it is very difficult to get that heard at Court of Appeal level. Because what you're doing is you're asking the Court of Appeal to rule on almost hypotheticals where the underlying facts have not been made out. As it is, as often is the case, when the court doesn't actually like the argument, they go on to make some criticisms of the argument if they were to hear it. But just on a threshold basis of will the Court of Appeal entertain that new argument, if it's laced with facts that weren't dealt with, were not pleaded, were not before the court at first instance, the Court of Appeal will be very reluctant to entertain that new argument. And in this case, they said, no, we're not going to.
And I think to build on that, Luke, I mean, even if these new arguments arise off facts that are not in dispute or were before the court, they were before the court within a certain context. They were interrogated by experts in a certain context. So I'm sure there will have been witness evidence and discussions of Vitol's internal practices and procedures, but they weren't discussed in the context of this counterfactual. So even if you are confident that you don't require, I suppose, factual evidence per se, these new arguments, so the factual evidence that has already been given may not be fit for purpose, even if you think it proves your point.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's what the court said here, wasn't it? There were kind of three elements to how this was new. It was new factually, it was new from an expert perspective, and it was new from a legal perspective. And its concept was just different. So it was conceptually different. And as you say there, Rufus, I completely agree that if you haven't got the right context within which to look at the facts, it's unfair then to kind of come back at a later stage and say, oh, well, the facts, meant this in a different context.
I think that idea of fairness is something that is quite always important to remember. I think it, especially for the non-lawyers listening, you might have the impression that the court is always trying to find the most just and the most fair resolution to a dispute. And whilst that is normally the case, fairness and justice also tie into the party's conduct during the pursuit of the prosecution of the case, because it's not fair to ambush another party at a late stage of proceedings with new arguments or new evidence, because had that information or argument been made available at the proper time to the other party, that may well have influenced their decision to continue either to continue pursuing a claim if you're the claimant, or whether or not one may wish to settle, or indeed may impact your overall litigation strategy. So even if there is this new evidence that you'd love to slam down on the judge's desk that says completely proves your case, if you don't reduce it at the right time, then you can't really complain that ultimately the court is not prepared to hear it after the first instance ruling has been given.
You're right, Rufus. And look, this is dealt with in the case of Jones and MBNA 2000, which was about fairness, most certainly, but also about the efficient use of court resources. And that's another element to this, because it's not efficient. It's something that the courts will dissuade and will not be entertained unless there's very good reason for it. Now, if there's a question that's a pure legal question that doesn't go to the facts, even then there are some thresholds to jump through. So an appellant court will only allow a pure point of law to be raised that hadn't been raised before if three criteria are satisfied: that the other party has had adequate time to deal with the point. So you can't just dump it into a skeleton argument right before the hearing and, they have no notice of it at all. The other party has not acted to his detriment on the faith of the earlier omission to raise it. And thirdly, that the other party can be adequately protected in costs. So that's in the situation where it doesn't deal with any facts and it's a completely new legal point. Even still, there is this concept of fairness, as you say, where you can't spring it. Ambush is the word you use. You can't ambush your other party with arguments, as the hearing's going on. That's not how we deal with it in any court hearing, frankly. But it's that principle of fairness and efficient use of court resources that's really important here. But the court did go on actually to make some comments on the argument, this new argument. So the basic point was it wasn't allowed. So it was tossed. The court then could have just drawn a line under the judgment. It didn't need to go on to provide any commentary at all on the actual substance of this new argument. But helpfully for us, it did touch on it. So did you have anything that you wanted to mention on the actual substantive elements of this argument?
I think the fundamental fatality to Ryan's argument here is, it is impossible on the basis of the counterfactual that they presented to know what the terms of this hypothetical external hedging would have been. They do make the assertion that the court should be guided by the delta that the Vista system produced. But the court's fairly dismissive at this point. They say there is nothing to support that argument. Nothing has been pleaded to support that argument, and then the court does not suggest that this is an argument that gives any real credence to. So I think fundamentally, from Ryan's point of view, they have presented an argument that is just a bridge too far into I suppose hypothetical arguments that's not grounded in evidence, that's not grounded in fact, and they're basically asking, as you mentioned earlier, Luke, they're asking the court to rule on a hypothetical and to make a real world adjustment to an award in damages for proven losses on the basis of a hypothetical and unproven scenario.
Yeah, I think you're right, Rufus. I think there was trying to work out what the exact oppositional risk would have been here required some speculation. There wasn't clear evidence on it, but even if there was evidence on it, there would have been difficulties, I think, in making out what the quantum would have been. There was a question about the accuracy of the Vista system, and whether it was 100% accurate or not. There's a point made in here that when you're talking about the volumes that Vitol trades, to try and identify what that exact oppositional risk would have been, and then argue, well, Vitol would or would not have done this. It seems to be introducing layers of speculation that, at least on the evidence that was before the court and brought out at first instance, just wasn't there. Whether had this matter been properly ventilated at first issue, there could have been evidence on this. I just don't know. There may well have been. But I think the court had concerns that even if this was properly ventilated at first instance, it still would have been difficult to identify and quantify what that type of loss would have been.
And I think this comes back to the point we were already discussing at the start, Luke, which is Vista is not a hedging platform. It is an internal risk management platform. So the way that it's not set up to try and identify external opposing positions. It doesn't make its allocations based on the same set of motivations or factors that one of Vitol's brokers would do when going to market to hedge a risk externally. So to try and use Vista as a way of as being indicative of how Vitol would deal with its external hedging is really trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, I think.
Yeah, and there was also some evidence where one of the Vitol witnesses had said that what Vitol will do is that they may go and use external hedges to protect the entity's position as a whole. And Ryan's counsel had to really be arguing that may meant would. It just wasn't there. The evidence wasn't there because in some ways it wasn't properly ventilated at first instance. But even if this was ventilated at first instance, I doubt that answer would have been any different. I think there would have been a number of factors that went into whether Vitol entered into an external hedge on that oppositional risk and trying to reduce that. So, yeah, it's stepping back for a moment from this whole case, though. It is really interesting, and I know it's come through quite clearly your view on this and the Vista system, and that it is very much a kind of netting risk management tool rather than a hedging tool. But I do wonder whether there's, and I know the law might not be on the side of this, but it does seem like quite a convenient way of being able to put trades against each other and cover off losses, albeit nominally or in a non-external way. But there is definitely a risk minimization or a risk management dimension to this type of platform, which is really the purpose of hedging, right? And you can just play on the paper market and trade the paper market and try and speculate on the paper market itself. I know that, but when used in tandem with physical trading, it is a risk minimization tool. It's about locking in your margin and making sure that you've got that ability to make margin irrespective of which way the market moves. I do look at a judgment like this with a bit of a wry grin in that legally speaking, I understand why from the perspective of certainty and law and having hard rules around this, why you only look at specific external hedges against a physical trade to reduce the loss. And that's the principle that this case continues to uphold. But I still can't help but think, well, the trader here is running a very sophisticated program that automatically works in a kind of netting off way that allows them, as a matter of practice, to minimize their losses. So in reality, they are running a kind of risk mitigated portfolio, but they're not doing it in a way where the court would make them bring to bear the other windfalls that they make along the way. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I was having to think about that as you were talking, and actually, when I read Mr. Berry's argument, so the barrister who was on for Rhine on the appeal. Yeah, you can see the logic behind what he's saying from a practical point of view. I think you can say with fairly decent certainty, obviously, subject to the fact that sometimes Vitol may let risk ride, but you can say with fair certainty that his characterization of what would have happened had the breach not occurred, it probably would have come to pass. They may well have gone out to market and covered the position elsewhere. But it's so from I suppose from a man to the man on the street, it does seem like a fair assessment of the position. But as you say, to me, and I think obviously to the court as well, it's not certain and provable enough for the court to take action, especially at this late stage. But I certainly do have sympathy towards Rhine on a practical level, because it's a fairly inventive argument. But I can, for the reasons we've discussed at length today, see why the court was not moved in this instance.
Yeah, I see too. And I certainly got to understand the legal principles here. And for those who are interested, it kind of traces back to a couple of 2010 cases, the Choil Trading and Sahara Energy Resources case, and the Glencore Trans World Oil case as well. And those authorities were not challenged on appeal in this matter. But if you're interested in looking some more on the law around this, that's the place to go and look. Yeah, I don't know. There's a part of me that thinks it's a sophisticated navigation of the law here by the trader. And maybe that's not what they have in mind, whether they choose whether to internally hedge versus externally hedge. They're just looking at it from a portfolio basis. And, as we say, looking at it from more kind of risk management than anything else. But yeah, I don't know. I have a little bit of sympathy, I've got to say, on a practical level for the owners here. Interesting one. I thought this was a great case. It had some good stuff on hedging, difference between internal, external hedging. Really good case to understand and really think through the way that commodity traders mitigate the risks in their business, how that then interacts with legal principles, and what does get brought into the loss analysis, what gets offset, what doesn't get offset. And yeah, there's a lot to kind of chew on. And then from a practitioner's perspective, as we've talked about, you've got this issue about running new arguments and all of that. And I know Calum and I have mentioned this before, Rufus, in many other cases we've talked about before. But when you're reading these Court of Appeal decisions, often you can see how, well, I wish, if you were in the practitioner's spot here, you'd be like, oh, I wish I kind of reformulated this earlier on. I wish we had this as one of the arguments at the outset. And that's not intended with any criticism at all, because we've all been there. And it just goes to show how important it is to think through the various arguments at pleading stage, right back at the first instance, and not just applying that creativity at the tail end as you're getting into the depths of appellant courts. So anyway, do you have any other final thoughts?
Not particularly, just beyond saying, I think it's one of those. I think as Court of Appeal judgments do tend to be, there's so much to unpack here in a lovely 30-page judgment. I really enjoyed getting into the weeds on this one, and going back and revisiting the first instance case. So I just want to say thank you for having me on this podcast. It's been fantastic.
Not at all, Rufus. It's been a real pleasure to have you on. Thank you for your time and getting into it. And thank you to all our listeners. If you're listening to this, you've gone all the way through. So thank you for listening in. We hope you've gotten something from it, and that it's been an interesting discussion for you. Stay tuned in the usual places: Spotify, YouTube, Apple, all those good spots for getting your podcast, your case by case, for the next installment. Thanks again for listening, and have a good day. See you.